Hi, everybody. I'm really pleased to be here. As Kevin said, I'm Grace Arnold. I'm the Commissioner of the Department of Commerce. Energy resources and energy technologies are among the 40 areas of oversight that Commerce has oversight. And today we're releasing a greenhouse gas report in conjunction with the Minnesota Pollution Control Agency. It's a report that's annual and goes to the legislature and represents a lot of work, not just for the agencies who develop the work, but also the work of many people and businesses and communities across the state that have contributed to greenhouse gas emission reductions. I want to thank the staff from the MPCA and Commerce and the other climate sub-cabinet agencies who created this report. There's a lot of work that went into it. But I also want to recognize and thank Minnesotans across the state for their efforts in reducing greenhouse gases, as the report shows. We have a lot of successes to celebrate. And we also have a clear path forward to additional greenhouse gas reductions through the actions that are outlined in Minnesota's Climate Action Framework. We have a really historic opportunity for investments in clean energy, in community resilience, and other steps to reduce greenhouse gases in all areas of our economy. We have actions that are happening now, and we are acting to make critical investments in the future, from billions of dollars in federal funding for clean energy technologies and actions by the state legislature to advance climate policies in Minnesota, to collective efforts happening across the state by individuals and businesses, schools and local governments, communities of all types and sizes, and our tribal nations. All of these investments are actions to help Minnesota address and prepare for climate change. Minnesota's Climate Action Framework, which was rolled out in September after 3 years of work and contributions from thousands of Minnesotans, lays out a positive vision with action steps and measurable goals to help Minnesotans address and prepare for climate change. Our actions will strengthen Minnesota's economy and environment and our health. So let me introduce Commissioner Kessler from the Minnesota Pollution Control Agency, and she's going to present on the report.
Thank you, Commissioner Arnold, and good morning, everyone. I'm Katrina Kessler. I'm the Commissioner of the Minnesota Pollution Control Agency. Thanks for joining us today as we walk through the key findings from our report on Minnesota's greenhouse gas emissions from 2005 to 2020. To develop our greenhouse gas inventory, the Minnesota Pollution Control Agency and the Department of Commerce source data from a variety of organizations, including federal agencies like the Environmental Protection Agency, the Census Bureau, and the U.S. Department of Agriculture, as well as state agencies such as the Minnesota Department of Agriculture and the Driver and Vehicle Services. We follow best practices and accounting principles based on guidance from the Environmental Protection Agency. Minnesota's work to reduce climate pollution is paying off. Our state reduced greenhouse gas emissions by 23% between 2005 and 2020. If we maintain current trends, we are on track to meet our goal of reducing greenhouse gas emissions in Minnesota by 30% by 2025. This is the goal established by the Next Generation Energy Act in 2007. Individuals, businesses, and local governments across Minnesota are taking steps to reduce climate pollution, and this inventory shows that these actions are working. During the pandemic, emissions declined across all sectors of our economy. However, emissions from key sectors were already trending downward in 2018 and 2019. There is still significant work ahead to meet our long-term goals. And as Commissioner Arnold highlighted, we released in September a climate action framework, and that framework sets new greenhouse gas reduction goals for our state based on the best available science. Those include reducing greenhouse gas emissions by 50% by 2030 and achieving net zero emissions by 2050. To meet these goals, we must double down on our commitment to reducing climate pollution by advancing the climate action framework. This chart breaks down our current greenhouse gas emission sectors. From left to right, you can see levels of greenhouse gas emissions from transportation, ag and forestry, electrical generation, industrial uses, commercial, residential, and waste sectors, all between 2005 and 2020. Emissions from electricity generation have been on a long-term downward trend. Emissions from certain other sectors, such as transportation and commercial buildings, began to turn downwards in the years leading up to 2020. Seeing the emissions from these sectors turn downward prior to 2020 could indicate that they may be on a longer term downward trend. Future years of data will show whether these are sustained trends. While there is much work ahead of Minnesota to meet our climate goals, this inventory demonstrates that collaborative action across sectors work. Transportation remains the largest source of greenhouse gas emissions in Minnesota, accounting for more than a quarter of the state's total emissions. There was significant reduction in emissions from this sector in 2020 due to the decrease in vehicle traffic during the COVID pandemic. Within the transportation sector, passenger vehicles, light-duty trucks, including SUVs, and medium to heavy-duty trucks produce more than 70% of the emissions. This chart shows the top emission sources within the transportation sector. Although transportation is the largest source of climate pollution in Minnesota, emissions from this sector are trending downward and have dropped 18% since 2005. As you can see, light-duty trucks accounted for 37% of the emissions, with heavy-duty trucks and passenger cars accounting for 19% and 18% of emissions from this sector, respectively. The emissions picture from the agriculture and forestry sector is complicated. This sector groups together activities that emit greenhouse gases like fertilizer application and activities that offset and store greenhouse gases like growing trees. Net emissions from this sector have not dropped since 2005. Gross emissions and sequestration have both increased, but when added together, net emissions are flat. As a result of emission declines in other sectors, agriculture, forestry, and land use is now our second highest source of greenhouse gases in Minnesota. Growing climate-smart farms, forests, and grasslands are key to reducing our overall climate impacts and getting us to the net zero emission goal as a state. Climate pollution from growing crops and raising animals continues to rise, while farmers continue to bear the brunt of extreme weather and a changing climate. Providing resources and incentives to farmers to continue to adopt climate-friendly practices like growing precision nutrient management or no-till or low-till farming will be critical to reaching our climate goals. This chart shows top sources and sinks of emissions from the agriculture and forestry sector. Since 2005, nitrous oxide emissions from crop agriculture has increased by 9%, and methane emissions from animal agriculture increased by 10%. These trends are noteworthy because nitrous oxide and methane are two potent greenhouse gases with significantly higher global warming potential than carbon dioxide, which means this sector is especially important to address it when considering potential climate solutions. As you can see in the chart, carbon sequestration in forests is a significant offset, as forests can act as a sink for the carbon that we emit. The electricity generation sector has achieved the most emission reductions since 2005. As a result, this sector has dropped to be Minnesota's #3 source of greenhouse gas emissions. At the time of our last inventory, it was the second highest source. Minnesota continues to see excellent progress in reducing emissions from the electricity generation sector due to reductions in the amount of coal burned, expanded use of renewable energy, first driven by the state's renewable energy standard and now driven by the low cost of renewable energy, and improvements in energy efficiency. This chart shows the top sources of emissions within the electricity generation sector. Minnesota has reduced climate pollution from our power sector 54% since 2005. Fossil fuels like coal and natural gas make up the bulk of emissions from this sector. Both of Minnesota's largest utilities, Xcel Energy and Minnesota Power, have committed to producing 100% carbon-free electricity by 2050. So we can expect to see further reductions in emissions from this sector in the coming years. So let's talk about how we're addressing the emissions. As you heard from Commissioner Arnold, Minnesota's Climate Action Framework, developed with input for over 3,000 Minnesotans, gives us a clear path forward to reducing our greenhouse gas emissions across the state. It identifies near-term actions that we must take to achieve our long-term vision of a carbon-neutral, resilient, and equitable future for the state. And every Minnesotan will play a role in the work that it will take to make this vision a reality. The framework is organized around these 6 goals. Within the framework, each goal chapter includes a summary of the challenges we face to meet the goal, priority actions and larger initiatives needed, measures to help gauge our progress, and equity considerations and opportunities for addressing them. The Climate Action Framework provided a foundation for many of the Walz-Flanagan administration's 2023 budget proposals, which will cut climate pollution while adding thousands of jobs across the state. We will have time for questions about these findings shortly, but first we will like to hear from two experts engaged in this important work. At this point, I will pass things back to Commissioner Arnold to begin our discussion on how Minnesotans can reduce our greenhouse gas emissions.
All right, thanks, Commissioner Kessler. So now we're joined by two local experts to have a discussion about the challenges and opportunities of reducing greenhouse gases in Minnesota. So joining us today are Professor Richard Graves, who's the director for the Center for Sustainable Building Research at the University of Minnesota, and Pat Luneman, who's the owner of Twin Eagle Dairy and a member of the Climate Action Framework Advisory Council. So Professor Graves, let's start with you. The energy resources we use to power and heat our homes and businesses are a major source of greenhouse gas emissions in Minnesota. What steps can we take collectively as a state to make our buildings more efficient and reduce those emissions?
Great, thanks, Commissioner. First up, the greenhouse gas impact of buildings shows up in multiple sectors: transportation, electricity and fuel use. First, transforming the way we build to meet the challenge of climate change starts with energy efficiency. New and existing homes and buildings should be designed and renovated to not waste energy. Better wall and roof insulation, windows, heating and cooling equipment, and other measures are essential. And most of this technology exists today and just needs to be scaled up. This will save people and businesses money in Minnesota. Second, after efficiency, the energy needed to power our lives needs to come from renewable resources in the electric grid, the fuels we use at different scales. And this will be critical to meet the challenge of climate change, be resilient in a dynamic future, and provide jobs in many areas of the economy.
Thanks, Professor Graves. Mr. Luneman, you operate a dairy farm here in Minnesota and have been very involved with agricultural industry groups in the state. Can you share a little bit about how you and other Minnesota farmers are feeling the impacts of climate change?
Yes, thank you, Commissioner. What we're really seeing is the weather extremes. They're just becoming ordinary, so to speak, unlike anything that we've seen in the past. We look back at the last 2 years. In 2021, here on our farm and across much of the Midwest, we had a severe drought. Then this past year, we had a very late spring, and here locally, we had a punishing mid-May storm doing a lot of damage to trees and to buildings. And then on Memorial Weekend, we had a tornado in our neighboring town that came along with torrential rainfall, and then followed up by other things that we don't even think about. The plague of the forest tent caterpillars, which terrorize our basswood trees in our forests and really make for some very unhappy honeybees and it's just a real impact. That was followed by the alfalfa weevils, which just tortured our alfalfa fields and just turned them brown so they couldn't even grow. And then this fall, we again returned to drought, and the cover crops that we tried to plant had difficulty germinating just because of the lack of water. This is happening not only here in Minnesota, but it's also a global phenomenon. As we look at our soils in our fields and across the state, soil organisms, our soils are just living. There's billions of microorganisms in the soils. They do not like extremes. And so these climate extremes are very tough on them. Those little microbes don't like it too wet, too dry. They want to be well fed and they want it just right on the temp. They're just like us as people, really. And if we have healthy soils, that creates good crops, better opportunity for carbon capture. I say that we need to lean on science here to figure out how to deal with these weather extremes. At the same time, leaning on some traditional wisdom that we on the farm have gathered over the years. And I would lay a bit of caution here, make sure that farmers have the essential tools in their toolbox to be able to deal with these climate extremes.
Thanks, Pat. So I'll ask another question to Professor Graves. What would signal to you that we've made the next big leap forward, especially when it comes to energy efficiency?
Yeah, thanks, Commissioner. We changed the curriculum at the School of Architecture at the University of Minnesota so that every architect that has graduated from the school since 2020 know how to design a carbon neutral or clean and efficient building. And I think the thing that, when I see that every builder, every electrician, every owner of buildings, every developer has the same base of knowledge, which is very achievable. We can build and renovate most of the buildings in Minnesota to be cost effective, healthier, and meet our goals for climate change.
Great. One last question for Mr. Luneman. Could you tell us about the types of action farmers in Minnesota are taking to reduce their greenhouse gas emissions, and how can the state support this work?
Commissioner, you alluded to this previously, but the move to precision ag, and this is happening in both the crop and the livestock sector. Some examples would be the grid soil sampling that we do that enables us to do variable rate fertilizer and also even seeding rates. Sometimes this even includes manure, believe it or not, because that is a fertilizer. The science that we have that's bringing us things like nitrogen inhibitors that make sure the nitrogen does its work in the soil and not goes up into the air. Advances in soil biologics that we can add and additives to the soil just to make those little microbes work better. And then on the equipment side, the technology, the efficiency and the productivity and the move to cleaner equipment just keeps moving along. I know that some of those machines look huge, but it's amazing what they will get done on an amount of fuel. The movement to no-till and minimum till keeps moving along, and our tillage practices are changing as well. There's new tools out there that do what's called vertical tillage that do their job while leaving residue on the surface. On the livestock side, we've got precision rations, which lower the amount of phos and nitrogen coming out of the back end of the animals. And actually on our farm, the milk that leaves every day is lab tested to determine if there are ways that we can tweak our ration to lower the amount of nitrogen that's used. What the state needs to do is we need better data so that we know exactly where we're at today in agriculture, in our fields and forests, and get a true measurement of where we're at, what's going on, and then that will draw us out, help us draw a map to where we need to go in the future. We need to do more in-field research so that we know what actually works. Some of what our university does is great, but we need to get out in the field and make sure it works. We need to fill in the gaps. So industry and the federal programs that are coming out, they're great, but there are going to be some gaps in there that the state can have a role in filling. And then last, we need to have collaboration. We've got great ideas. We've got organizations, companies, individuals, entities that are all have plans to combat climate change. But in order for that to work, we're going to have to come together. We're going to have to work together. And I think the state can play a role in facilitating that collaboration. Thank you.